Welcome back to the In Chamber. I'm your host, Tom Schumann. I'm sure most people are familiar with the phrase, if I only had a nickel, or a dime, or a quarter, pick your coin denomination, for every time someone said or did something, I'd be rich. Let me give you an example. If I only had a nickel for every time my son walked by the math teacher in high school to go visit the cross-country coach instead, fill in the blank. A story some of you might be able to relate to. A true story, but I know my college-age son doesn't listen to this podcast. It's not cool enough for him. Anyway, over 20 plus years at the Indiana Chamber, I and others have certainly heard a common refrain that Indiana needs to do a better job of tooting its own horn, telling our story about why the state is such a great place to work and live. You've heard it before. We don't have mountains or beaches, but we do have friendly people, a low cost of living, and many more attributes. Now, we're not going to spend the next 30 minutes sharing that story, as it would be a bit like preaching to the choir, so to speak. What we are going to do, through a conversation with the leader of this organization, is share the business climate story, how the state went from some severe depths 20 years ago to some lofty heights as we enter the third decade of this century. To help us do so is the President and CEO of the Indiana Chamber, Kevin Brinegar. Welcome back to the In Chamber.
Greetings, Tom. Glad to be back with you on another podcast this year.
Kevin, let's start with the year 2000. Those who remember back that far probably have recollections of the dot-com boom, maybe a little Y2K fear that came into play, and a few other items. But talk about what was the Indiana business climate like at that time?
Well, we were at the tail end of a lengthy period of economic expansion, and we were doing okay overall, but we were truly riding the wave or the coattails of the U.S. economy. But when you peeled the onion back, Indiana was not doing so well on many business climate and key economic measures. We were trailing. For example, we were 50th in job creation in 2000, 50th in job growth. We were first, but it was in bankruptcies and home foreclosures. And during that dot-com boom that you referenced, we were the only state to suffer a net loss of technology jobs. And we were ranked 50th in economic momentum as measured by Governing Magazine, and 50th in the percentage of our labor force employed in professional, scientific, and managerial occupations. And I've got an even longer list, and in every rank we're in the 40s among the 50 states.
So that's a pretty telling story there, and obviously, as Kevin explained, those 50s are among the 50 states and exactly where you don't want to be in the vast majority of these rankings. So we're not doing as well. As you said, it's a little bit of a hidden story because overall the economy in the U.S. is good. Some of the reasons for that, let's talk taxes. Before becoming president in 2002, you headed up the Chamber's government affairs teams. You were the tax authority, the tax expert for the Chamber. I recall my first days at the Chamber, some inventory tax day at the State House, rather extravagant demonstrations to illustrate the nature of that tax. Talk about those a little bit, some of the tax things that were in place that were leading to those rankings.
Sure. Well, we were one of only 9 states that imposed a tax on business inventory. You paid on your finished goods, your raw materials, and your work in progress. And it really dissuaded manufacturers from locating here, and you paid it based on the inventory you had in place on March 1st. And so we used to see all these car dealerships having great sales in the month of February, trying to get their inventory down. And to drive home the point of what a regressive, poor tax this was and harmful to our business and economic and job growth, I found out that you can reserve all the parking spaces around the state capitol through the city of Indianapolis, and you don't even have to pay for them. It was just a special event. And so I secured on March 1st the parking spaces around the state capitol, and then filled those spaces with examples of what our members across the state were paying inventory tax on that day. So we had big pieces of machinery, we had farm equipment, we had truckloads of cars, and then we had a rally inside the state to say we need to get rid of this tax.
And this was for several years, I recall.
Yeah, it took several years. It's like the old saying I have that at the State House, good ideas take at least 3 years to pass, and bad ideas only take one. And so this took several years of sort of pounding the legislature, so to speak, with inventory tax day rallies. But in 2002, we finally accomplished that, along with some other addressing some other bad things in our tax climate.
Well, what were some of those other things? It wasn't just the inventory tax.
No.
There were certainly other things that contributed to those rankings.
Sure. Well, one, we had a corporate net income tax that was among the 10th highest in the country, and we were only one of 3 states that had a corporate gross receipts or gross income tax. And that was a tax that you got to pay whether you were profitable or not. And the way the old tax system used to work was you calculated the net income tax liability and the gross liability, and then you got the privilege of paying the higher of the two. We also had an inheritance tax, which drove high-income people out of our state, the inventory tax as well. So collectively, it made for one of the worst tax climates for businesses in the country.
Well, Kevin, in recent years, each of the last 3 years at least, we've heard from the Indiana Economic Development Corporation announcing record-setting numbers for either new jobs attracted, or I know for 2019 it was average wages of those jobs. With these factors in place you described, I imagine there weren't too many such announcements, celebrations back in the 2000, 2001 time frame.
No, there really weren't. And the problem was we were not prepared for the next recession, which came in 2001. And so, no, we don't have we didn't have the competitive advantage then that we have today, as we've done this 20-year effort to improve Indiana's business climate and be one of the best in the country.
And it wasn't just taxes. Let's talk education a bit. I was amazed last year doing a kind of an update on one of our foundation studies, looking at the things in education that are now we have to consider commonplace or so important to our efforts that just didn't exist in 2000.
No, a number of things. One, there really were no academic standards or any form of accountability. School districts were just sort of on their own to educate kids as they saw best. We didn't have any parental choice for particularly low-income families. We were one of only 14 states that didn't even have public charter schools. We didn't have full-day kindergarten for those students. We didn't have pre-K, state-funded pre-K for low-income families so that they would have the same head start as other families. And we had a system that really drove through collective bargaining that management wasn't really running and managing our schools, and so that was addressed later on as well.
Kevin, on the in-chamber here, we haven't talked a lot about Economic Vision 2010, the Chamber's first economic development plan, or the current Indiana Vision 2025. Those familiar with the Chamber, however, know about these plans through the biennial report cards, the regional forums around the state, and this overall accountability of what needs to be done to keep making Indiana better. Talk about the importance of those plans a bit and the role that they play.
Well, if I go back to 1999, when we were being pulled along by the rest of the U.S. economy, but really we're not doing very well compared to other states. The leaders of the Indiana Chamber of Commerce at that time, my predecessor and several board members, had this inkling that we really, as a state, weren't doing that well, and we were vulnerable to that next recession. And the state didn't have an economic development action plan, and so the Chamber decided to create one. And the first one was called Economic Vision 2010, and that covered the period from 2000 to 2010. And it had a number of goals to help improve on those metrics and many more that I read off earlier in this conversation, and became the guiding star for the Chamber's advocacy. And we used it to drive public policy in the State House to improve Indiana's business climate and our overall position competitively versus the other states. Then from there in 2011, we developed a second and is still now our current plan, Indiana Vision 2025. And by having those plans and those goals, we have produced many accomplishments each and every year. It wasn't one silver bullet, but over time, we have turned Indiana or transformed Indiana from bottom half and often bottom 10 in many important metrics to one of the top business and economic and job growth climates in the entire country, and we're even top 5 on many important metrics today.
We're going to get to some of those metrics. Let's talk about how we got there. So we told the story a few minutes ago, Kevin did, of what things were like circa 2000. But that tax climate that was a hindrance is now one of the best in the country. How did that happen?
Well, a couple of big tax reform efforts. One, we eliminated the inventory tax that we talked about a moment ago. Corporate gross receipts tax was eliminated. We have been lowering our corporate net income tax from what was the 6th highest in the country. We're in a phase down that'll go a couple more years, and when it's finished, will be second lowest in the country. We also did a number of things that are kind of technical tax things, like adopt what's called a single sales factor apportionment formula, so we don't penalize companies on their income tax for having people and property and facilities in Indiana. We also eliminated something called the throwback rule, which used to say that if you earned income in another location outside of Indiana that didn't tax it, that income was automatically thrown back to Indiana and taxed, even though the income wasn't earned here in the state of Indiana. So we really have cleaned up our tax code and our tax structure, and we're now ranked by the National Tax Foundation as 10th best in the country, and that's a major transformation, and that has helped make Indiana a much, much more attractive place to come and do business.
And Kevin, one in the last few years that we certainly emphasized and worked hard on, the software as a service, the sales tax exemption on that, being one of only 3 states, I believe, at the time when it was passed, but the important message that sent also.
Yeah, that helps grow our technology sector. And then last year we passed legislation on big data centers to give them a sales tax exemption on the massive amounts of equipment that go into those big data centers, as well as the opportunity for local units of government to give them an exemption from the business personal property tax. And we've seen a flurry of activity in these big data centers, one particularly in northwest Indiana. And it's amazing the amount of space and the amount of equipment that goes into these things. And I tell people that the cloud really isn't up in the cloud; it's in these gigantic data warehouses here on the ground that produce a lot of investment and a lot of related jobs to
and those are clouds we don't mind seeing. Bring more of those to Indiana.
Yeah, we love those clouds.
We might want to get rid of some of the ones up in the sky these days in winter, but that's okay. Let's talk about education. We talked about what was missing in 2000, and not that all the challenges are solved in that area, but how important have these reforms been of implementing many of these things that simply weren't in existence 20 years ago?
Well, I think they're extremely important, and it has helped move our educational achievement levels and outcomes up. We now have high-reaching academic standards, which have been rated by several national organizations as among the best in the country. We have an accountability system, so parents and community individuals know how well or how poor their schools are performing, puts a little bit of good old-fashioned competitive pressure on. We now have one of the most expansive, I think actually the most expansive school choice scholarship programs for low-income families, so they have the same choices that wealthier families have in terms of where to send their children. We also have public school choice. You can choose to go to another public school if you want, and of those parents that are exercising school choice, the largest number and portion of those are actually going to another traditional public school, not to a private school or to a charter school, which we've also enacted. And it's just been a wonderful transformation that has moved us, and not that we still don't have ways to go, but our percentage of our population that has a post-secondary credential has improved, and we're moving towards that big goal of 60%. And we've seen great growth in our national assessments, things like National Assessment of Educational Progress. They do assessments at 4th grade language arts, math, and science, and 8th grade language arts, math, and science. And Indiana ranks in the top 15 states in all 6 of those metrics and top 10 in all but one of them.
Kevin, we talked taxes and education. Certainly, there's many other things contributing in the broader economy. Number of developments again over this 20-year period. Share a few of those highlights. Some of the things that have really helped establish Indiana as the place where we should be tooting our own horn.
Well, there have been a number of accomplishments in other areas, and if I may say so, Tom, your Indiana Chamber of Commerce has been the tip of the spear or a major player in each and every one of these, using first Economic Vision 2010 and now Indiana Vision 2025 as the guiding star, along with the report cards that we produce every other year that keep score and provide metrics and show policymakers where we're still deficient and give them solutions. But some of the other areas.
I was going to say, Kevin, and you talk about that, and again, we've had the opportunity to both be here 20 years plus, but you think about some of the talented people we've had come through this organization and the work we do, not just in the policy side, but in the other areas. It's truly been a pleasure of mine and kind of amazing to see that the impact that this organization does have while partnering with many others on these initiatives.
Yes, indeed. And we've had great leadership and great support from our board of directors in particular, as well as our broader membership, who have seen the vision, embraced it, and said Indiana can and should do better, and will support the Chamber's efforts to get us there. Going back to your question about other key policy victories that have improved Indiana's economic climate, one was infrastructure. In 2000, we had aspirations to connect I-69 from Indianapolis to Evansville, to make US 31 limited access and get rid of all the stoplights up and down, and several other projects, but we had no plan or no funding to accomplish that. We've now had 2 major transportation infrastructure packages. First, major moves, which was the leasing of the toll road that provided about a $4 billion infusion of infrastructure funding. And then in 2017, we passed additional infrastructure funding package to particularly, one, offset the eroding of our revenues through technology, because cars and trucks were going farther on a gallon of gas, and that was the tax base, was a gallon of gas. And we now have an infusion of $1.2 billion more a year for both state highways, and 40% of that money goes to local roads. It's a fully funded 20-year plan that no other state in the country has. So that was an important one. We became the first state in the Midwest to enact right to work, and our Economic Development Corporation has documented the many, literally billions of dollars and thousands of jobs that the company said that Indiana being a right to work state was one of, or the most important factor in them choosing Indiana. We also built out our telecommunication infrastructure by being one of the first states to pass comprehensive telecommunications deregulation. That happened in 2006, and since then we've seen billions of dollars of investment, and it also positioned Indiana to be one of the first areas in the country to have 5G technology deployed, and that's an ongoing effort there.
I've got one for you, Kevin. Can you believe it's been 15 years since daylight saving time was passed?
Well, now you're talking about my personal favorite. Prior to that, people outside of Indiana didn't know what time it was in Indiana, because we had 72 counties that were in the Eastern time zone but did not observe daylight savings time. So we were on Chicago time in the summer and New York time in the winter, And I used to refer to it as death by 1,000 paper cuts in the business community because of all the missed meetings and shipments either showing up early or late and all that. So we had 72 counties that didn't observe daylight saving time. We had 10 counties that were in the Eastern time zone, 5 around Cincinnati, 5 around Louisville, who were not supposed to observe daylight time, but they did illegally because they recognized that they were so economically connected to those large cities across the Ohio River that they needed to do that, and there was no time police coming along and making people change their clocks back.
Well, I take the blame for that. I grew up in Dearborn County. We were right across from Cincinnati, and we were among those illegal people changing their clocks for just the reasons you explained. So blame me.
And then we had 10 more counties that were appropriately in the central time zone, the counties up around Chicago and the counties in southwestern Indiana. Now, every county in the state observes daylight savings time, most of them Eastern, some of them appropriately central, again, up around Chicago and down in the southwestern part of the state. And it's cleaned things up and has been a boon to our economic efforts as well.
Well, and we don't always have to follow what other states do, but in this case, 47 states, I think, had it right. It was Indiana, Arizona, and Hawaii, as I recall, were kind of the holdouts. And with business being so international, as you said, it's just a necessity that, amazing that it took that long, but tremendous that it did take place.
Indeed.
Kevin, so we talked about a lot of these things. You gave us some rankings early on, and as you recall, 2000, Indiana, 50th in job creation, 50th in job growth, 50th in economic momentum. Those were a few of the bad things. Share some of today's numbers, today's rankings, and where Indiana stands in some related categories.
Tom, I'd be delighted to share where we are today, to show how far we have truly come in the first 2 decades of this century. We are now first in the nation for ranking as the best state government. We're first in the nation for infrastructure. We have, as I said, a funded 20-year plan. Fourth in the nation in business friendliness. Fourth for cost of doing business. Second for software job growth. Think about that. Indiana, here in the Midwest, had the second fastest growth of software jobs. We were first in the Midwest and 6th nationally for small business development. Tippecanoe County had the highest wage growth of any county in the country in 2018. We were first in the Midwest and 6th nationally for best business climate, 3rd in the nation for best regulatory environment. The Indianapolis airport has been ranked the best airport in the country for 7 years in a row, and 3 Indiana cities were ranked in the top 5 for the lowest cost of living. And I could go on and on. I've got 2 pages of these strong, positive rankings that we have worked to generate and achieve, again, over the last 20 years.
Well, one more point I want to make. We've talked a lot about the year 2000. Ironically, in that same year, we had the opportunity here to publish a book on the chamber history from John Walls, who was president of this organization from 1977 to 92. Mm-hmm. This informal history of the chamber dated back to the late 1890s, with the Indiana Chamber formally being incorporated in 1922. Mm-hmm. Business leaders came together at that time largely to equalize rail freight rates, which were higher for Indiana shippers. So amazingly, what that comes to, in other words, the Indiana Chamber has kind of been officially working to improve that Indiana business climate for nearly 100 years.
Well, it is an ongoing work in progress, and I have certainly read that book, and I think it is fair and appropriate to say that the Chamber has been a driving force for the Indiana economy for, as you say, over 100 years, with particular focus in the last 20 years because we've had these really outstanding economic development action plans developed by our volunteer leaders, people from the business community who know firsthand because they're on the front lines of where the problems are, where the challenges are, and what needs to be done to improve them. So we've had great guidance and great support from our board members and members in general.
So, Kevin, while the year 2020 is a lot brighter picture economically than 2000, there's still no shortage of important issues to address. The Chamber's working on, whether it's with the Indiana General Assembly or beyond. Talk about a few of the priorities, short-term, long-term, that we're working on to make sure Indiana stays closer to those desired number one rankings and away from the 45s and 50s among all the states.
Well, we're continuing to work on education and workforce attainment. We're currently 37th in percentage of populations with associate's degrees, 38th in bachelor degrees. That, in turn, is a drag on our per capita personal income, which has been declining in rank. Our per capita personal income has been growing, but not as fast as other states, and it's tied directly to our educational attainment. We have a situation with regard to slow population growth. From 2010 to 2018, Indiana's overall statewide population grew a little over 1%, but it went down in over half the counties, and is projected to go down further in roughly 2/3 of the counties between now and the year 2050. So we have to get the most out of the people that are here as far as their educational attainment, and we need to develop a strategy, and those are being developed and implemented to recruit people into our state who have talent and skills. And we've seen some states that literally have set up incentives for people with skills to come into their state or their city. We've seen it in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the state of Vermont. We've benefited, particularly in Northwest Indiana, from the significant exodus out of Illinois because their tax and financial and heavy regulatory burden situation is driving people out of their state, and Indiana is one of the big beneficiaries of that.
You know, when you drive in Northwest Indiana, it is more crowded coming back from Illinois than it is going into Illinois. You even notice it just driving it on the road?
I have noticed that. Our health metrics are, I've used the word abysmal. We are now, depending on which measure you use, we've gone in just a couple of years from 38th worst to 44th worst in our rate of smoking. Our rate of smoking is 50% higher than the national average, and that translates into an estimated $6.2 billion impact on Indiana businesses in the form of higher healthcare costs, absenteeism, and lost productivity. So the Chamber has been pushing a 4-point agenda along with other allies to raise the smoking age to 21, which we're on the verge of doing. It's been done nationally, but that only pertains to sales, not possession. So that's a little quirky. It's like saying, well, you got to be 21 to buy alcohol, but you don't have to be 21 to possess it. So we want to cover both bases. We also, and it won't happen this session, but we think there's a good chance in the 2021 long session of the General Assembly, we want to raise the cigarette tax by $2 a pack. Smokers are price sensitive, particularly teenagers and minors. They don't necessarily carry around a lot of cash, and so this would create a higher barrier of entry. We want to provide more funding for smoking cessation programs, and we want to repeal what I consider a pretty ridiculous statute that's referred to as the Smokers' Bill of Rights. It's something the tobacco companies pushed through the General Assembly in the early 90s that creates smokers as a protected class under our employment law policies. And so employers cannot ask if you're a smoker during an interview, and they can't assess higher copays and deductibles for smokers on their health insurance plans, even though they know those smokers are going to cost them more over time.
Kevin, final question as we wrap up, and thank you so much for sharing so much of this story and how Indiana's progressed over these 20 years. But as we've talked about this success statewide, we turn it personal, as we have with all of our guests this year. What does success mean to you when you think about it? Again, could be from the Chamber standpoint, professional, could be personal, but when you think about success, how do you kind of define that, or what it means for Kevin Brinegar?
Well, I had the advantage of knowing the question in advance, unlike some of your other guests.
Well, that's because you listen to all the podcasts.
Because I listen to all the podcasts.
We appreciate
that's
that.
Right. I'm a faithful listener. I would say two things. One is everything we've been talking about. We have a mission statement that focuses on maximizing prosperity for the people of Indiana and our enterprises, our businesses and our universities and other enterprises, and to see the transformation that has taken place over the past 20 years, which happens to pretty much overlap with my time as president here at the Chamber, is an incredible source of pride. But as you know, because I preach it to our staff, particularly our government affairs staff, we have to keep our foot on the pedal and keep moving forward to maintain the ground that we've gained and gain further. So that's a measure of success in my mind. The other is personal, and it has to do with being able to provide a good life for my family and my two children, and in particular, I have a daughter who's a physical therapist, so she did undergraduate work and then 3 years of graduate school to get her PT license, and I have a son who's finishing a law degree and an MBA, and of course did his undergrad work, and we've decided that the best thing that we can give them while my wife and I are still alive is a debt-free education. And being able to achieve that is a personal measure of success with respect to our family.
Well, they are two young people who I happen to know who will be contributing to Indiana's success in the future.
Yeah, they're staying here in the Indianapolis area, and so I tell folks that I've done my part for the brain gain, and we're delighted that they're pursuing their careers here close to home.
Kevin, thanks so much for joining us. And again, bring this full circle. We started off talking about tooting our own horn in Indiana, going out and touting the many great things that this state has to offer. You've heard Kevin talk about the tremendous progress that's been made. I guess we'll end with that same emphasis on don't be afraid to go out and talk about the many great things here in Indiana, and we encourage everyone to do that.
We certainly do. We have a great story to tell.
All right. Thanks again, Kevin. We appreciate you listening to this conversation, talking about the tremendous growth and success in Indiana over the past 20 years. The Indiana Chamber's annual Chamber Day dinner. I want to give a final reminder of that event coming up on February 11th at the Indiana Roof Ballroom. We'll hear from special keynote speaker General John F. Kelly, 45-year Marine Corps veteran who served as Secretary of Homeland Security and as Chief of Staff in the Trump administration. Many other Chamber events and activities coming up. We always encourage you to check out indianachamber.com for the latest. We'll be back with our next In-Chamber episode in 2 weeks. Thanks as always for listening.